Mr. Rajwade, it's your turn.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank the EPW and the Bombay Chambers for inviting me here. Second, I could not have the benefit of the presentations made in the earlier sessions. So I'm going to start off from in a way, zero-based budget. I think 2 or 3 preliminary points that as of now, there are many, many uncertainties in relation to the budget. The first, of course, is whether GST will come into play. If so, when? They are now talking of September or October. God knows if and when that will get implemented, because that has a major impact in terms of the budgeting, both of the central and state governments and indeed local governments. And I think as of now, politically, one doesn't know which way and when the GST issue will get sorted out. The second major uncertainties is about the impact of demonetization, how much unaccounted money they are going to unearth, how much tax will get recovered. I think all of us, it will take a long time before we get to know that. I think the third question mark is about what the panel, which is reviewing the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. I think their report is still to come, and that will once again.
So I'm interrupting you. We have a member of that panel right here sitting on my right, and he's maintained a discreet silence on the subject.
Yeah, but the formal report, I think we haven't had.
You go to the finance minister on the 17th of January.
Okay.
But
in 5 days from now, it's going to the FM.
So I think, given that these are 3 things, major issues of which most of us are unaware or ignorant, I think let me confine myself to 2 or 3 basic principles. The first is the question of the way the budget is presented and the budget accounting. I think one positive feature to my mind is that they seem to be bent on removing the plan and non-plan expenditure distinction. The question still in my mind is that should we be treating everything on the expenditure side similarly for calculating the budget deficit and any restrictions or targets for that? For example, increase in central government employees' salaries clearly is expenditure. Is investment in infrastructure the same kind of expenditure? The cash flow deficit, in fact, our budget in many ways is a cash inflow and outflow estimates rather than the sort of standard accounting. In fact, globally, a new accounting standard has been proposed for public, in other words, government accounting, but not many countries have so far adopted it, and I find that very useful. Makes a good distinction between what is expenditure and what is investment, because clearly, in my view, there is a major difference between budget deficit coming from investments, say in infrastructure, which will increase the GDP in the future, which are needed for future growth, than in purely establishment costs. And I think, as we all know, as Bombay Chamber, most of you are businessmen, you make a distinction between capital investment and what is expenditure. One goes to P&L account, the other gets capitalized. So is there a case? In my view, there is. And I think the new accounting standard takes that forward quite a bit, but I don't think many countries have adopted it. The third factor is that I think from whatever public pronouncements have been made by the finance minister, he is taking the 3% fiscal deficit limit as something of a holy cow. The question is it or should it be? In my own view, I think in many ways we are probably giving too much importance to fiscal austerity, which is very much a part of the standard neoliberal or laissez-faire agenda, which has been sort of popular with economists for the last 30 odd years. But I was pleasantly surprised recently to see even IMF research suggesting that both a liberal capital account and fiscal austerity have a negative impact on growth, and B, increased income inequalities. Now, this is sort of completely opposite to what the IMF had been advocating for the last 3 odd decades. In fact, the title of that article is neoliberalism ... oversold. So I think clearly, I think the agenda, also if you look at empirical evidence globally in terms of most countries, it seems that fiscal deficits in general increase the growth rate. And what they have found, I think one study which I remembered readily is by Reinhardt and Rogoff on crisis in global economy. Their benchmark, what they have found is that in most cases, when the public debt goes beyond 90% of nominal GDP, that is when growth starts falling. Now, in our case, my memory is that the total public debt, both the central and state governments taken together, is of the order of 60% of nominal GDP. So I think we are far away from the 90%, which is the kind of number which Rogoff and Reinhardt, and it's in a book form, how crisis, what kind of correlations exist between crisis and various macroeconomic numbers. And this is the kind of number which they are coming out with. 4, I think equally important for us, a point which was touched by Dr. Goyal as well, is that we need to create something like 12 million jobs, new jobs each year. Our population is growing at the rate of 20 million, accounting for retirements, accounting for housewives who may not be wanting to work outside. Still, we need to create something like 12 million plus jobs each year. The question then is that at some stage, financial stability may come at the cost of social stability. And I think that's one thing when we talk of budget. It is not just a set of numbers, but it affects ultimately so many other things. And our unemployment numbers, which come out, which show unemployment at 4 and 5% and thereabouts, I think in most cases they are meaningless. I suppose the rag picker in the morning is also counted as employed. Yes, he is self-employed. The question is, how long should he continue there? So I think there are many of these issues. In my view, my expectation would be, hopefully, that I do not know what the panel recommendation will come out with, what the government will accept, but there is no need to look at 3% as something like a Lakshman Rekha in the Ramayana, which if we cross it, chaos will follow. It doesn't. I think global experience and Also, I think one factor, which one point I would like to make before concluding, is that the so-called fiscal compression ratio, which is cut in the budget deficit and how much it impacts GDP growth. Now, for a long time, the belief was that it is of the order of 0.5%. The IMF's benchmark number was 0.5%. So if you cut budget deficit by 2%, it may cut growth by 1%. In other words, the ratio of outstanding debt to nominal GDP will fall with a cut in budget deficit. Now, they have come to a revised conclusion that it is much beyond 1, and in fact, it can be as high as 1.9. So the more you cut the budget deficit, the greater becomes the debt as a proportion of nominal GDP. Now, these are numbers which I am quoting from research, and mind you, this research has not come from any social democrat or leftist organization, but the IMF numbers are now saying that the fiscal compression ratio can be as high as 1.9. In other words, cutting the deficit by 1% will reduce the potential GDP growth by 1.9%. So I think, I do hope that after the panel report is studied, a total new look is taken at the issue of budget deficit at the macro level, the accounting in terms of whether the deficit comes out of investments or out of unproductive expenditure, and how to account for that, the accounting issues. I think these are some of the expectations. One looks forward to what's going to happen on 1st February, and one doesn't even know whether it is going to be 1st February or not, because I think that decision is still to come because of the elections in 5 states. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Rajwade. He has presented a different ideological position where he believes that this whole 3% fiscal deficit should not be treated as some sort of a holy cow, a Lakshman Rekha. He's used very, very interesting analogies which are very close to the ruling dispensation, as we are aware, the cow and our myths.